Welcome back. This is part 8 of our online tutorial series, and in this tutorial we're going to be looking at Designer's trigger view. So in previous tutorials we've created fixture layouts, we've created pixel matrices, we've patched fixtures, created lighting scenes, and also an interface for our touchscreen devices, the TPS and the TPC. But if we upload that program into the controller right now, it's going to effectively stay dormant. It's not going to play back any lighting scenes at specific times like we want it to, nor is stuff like the touchscreen interface going to be able to control the system. So in order to give it that logic, we need to use triggers. Now, essentially what happens here is you have 3 parts to this. There are triggers, there are conditions, and there are actions. I'm going to give you a typical scenario of how this would work. So let's say in a scenario we wanted a lighting scene to play back at a specific time of day, say sunset. We would have an astronomical trigger that fires at sunset, and then we would have an action, which is to start a specific scene. Now, you can go further into this by using something called a condition, and essentially a condition will give your system some logic that it needs to follow. So we're going to use the same scenario, but now we want the lighting scene only to start in the month of December. Again, we would have our astronomical event, our astronomical trigger that would fire at sundown, but this time it would have a condition that checks the month. If that condition returns true, then the action starts. But of course, if it's January or February and the condition returns false, then the action then never begins. So there are a whole host of different triggers that we can use within Designer. Actually, nowadays, in the latest version of Designer, we can use something called I/O modules to extend that functionality. Now, I'm going to come on to that a little bit later, but just to start off with, I'm going to give you a basic overview of some of the triggers and actions and conditions that you can use within Designer. So at the top left-hand corner here, we have our list of triggers. So click on New. And the first trigger that appears is the startup trigger. So this is a trigger that fires when the controller boots up or after an upload. Next, we have a soft trigger. This is a trigger that can be fired from the web interface. Then we have a set of playback triggers. So these are triggers that fire when either a timeline or scene starts or ends. Then we have flags. These are triggers that can essentially be put onto timelines at specific places. We have our time and astronomical based triggers. So a real-time trigger is a trigger that fires at a specific time of day. And then, of course, we have an astronomical trigger that fires at sunset or sunrise, as I've just mentioned. Underneath this, we have some physical inputs that we can work with. So a digital input or an analog input, which are both inputs on either the Rio or LPC devices. Think of these as like a relay. And then we have some triggers that allow us to integrate with other systems, so serial, Ethernet, DMX, and MIDI. Finally, at the bottom, we have a set of touch button triggers or touch event triggers for the TPC or TPS's touchscreen interface. And we can use that to link up certain buttons, sliders, or color pickers on the touchscreen interface with actions within our project file. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm just going to pick a very basic trigger to start off with. So I'm going to pick the startup trigger. And now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to attach an action to it. So if I go over to the right hand side, you'll see that there is another button next to the word action, which is called new. And if I select that, again, I get a list of lots of different actions that I can use. So to start off with, we're just going to look at the first couple of actions here. So we have start timeline, start scene, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick the start scene action. So now that I've picked that, I need to select the scene that I want to start. You'll notice that an exclamation mark or question marks appear here, indicating that I need to do some further configuration. And over in the right-hand side, you'll see that underneath the start scene action, we have a list of our scenes within our system. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick scene 1. And now I'm just going to do an upload to my controller just to check that that works. So again, I'm using Control U or Apple U. And I can tell you that the box of lights behind me has just come on. That being said, if you do want confirmation on your triggers and actions, and if you want to check your programming, you can do so using something called the controller's log. So over in the top right hand corner within the hamburger menu, there is an option to view the controller log viewer. I'm going to go ahead and open that. And this will give you a running list of events that the controller is processing. So right at the top here, we can see that a startup event has been received. And then trigger number 3 has started action number 1, start scene 1. Okay, so now I'm going to apply something called a condition. So let's take this scenario that we've got a startup trigger that fires a scene, but let's say that we only wanted this scene ever to start if it was nighttime. We could do that using a condition. And very simply, I can go to the top here, click on new, and then I can use one of these conditions to check the time of day. And to do that, we're going to use the astronomical condition. Just remember that astronomical is always to do with sunrise, sunset, so effectively daytime and nighttime. Again, just like before with the actions, over in the right-hand corner, our condition has some options which we can use to configure it. So at the moment, the condition is going to return true if it's between sunrise and sunset. Now that's daytime. So what we need to do is we just need to change the options about so that it's between sunset and sunrise. And effectively that's going to make it nighttime. Now I'm going to do another upload to the controller. And I just want you to bear in mind that it's currently about 5:30 in the UK, so it's daytime still. But this time when I go to the controller's log viewer, you can see that the trigger has fired and the condition has been rejected because it's daytime. If I was to do that in 4 or 5 hours time, then the condition would return true because it is of course nighttime. And of course the action would then go ahead and of course take place. Okay, cool. So I just want to now show you 1 or 2 other different types of scenarios that you can use within your programming, typical scenarios that come up again and again. So let's say that I wanted something specific to happen every single night at, let's say, 9 o'clock. I could do that using a real-time trigger. Real-time triggers are always specific times of day, unlike astronomical events, which of course are variables depending on the time of year. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick the real-time trigger. And over here in the real-time trigger options, there is a box called edit. I'm going to go ahead and click that. I'm just going to start off by showing you the basic view. So up here, as you can see, we have the option to set it to fire every single day, on weekdays, once a week, or even on a specific date. Let's keep this selected as every day. And now what I want it to do is I want it to fire at a specific time, 9 o'clock. So I'm going to click the once button and I'm going to select 2100 hours. So 9 o'clock. Now, once I've clicked OK, you'll see that in the trigger options, it says it's going to fire at 9 o'clock every day. I can go ahead and attach an action to this. So I'm going to click new, and this time I'm going to pick start timeline. Again, just like with the start scene actions, I'm going to make sure that I select the timeline that I want. I'm going to select timeline number 1. And there we go. We've now got a trigger that fires every single day at 9 o'clock. So again, keeping with this scenario, let's say that we wanted our system to stop any playback at say 2 in the morning. We could again do that with another real-time trigger. So just like before, click on your real-time trigger. We're going to again click edit. We're going to have it selected for every day. And then we're going to have this at 0 to 100 hours. But the type of action that we'd want to use here is something called release all. So again, just like before, you can select either your action from here, but alternatively, if you wanted to, you can do it from the bottom right-hand corner as well. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick the release all button. And that's going to kill all scenes and all timelines off within our programming. Now, what you might remember earlier on in the tutorials is that we can group specific timelines and scenes together. So for instance, if I had a scene that was running on an emergency area that was in group A, and I wanted to release all playback apart from my emergency timeline or scene, I can do so as long as it's in a group. And we've got options to do that down here. I can either release by all timelines of scenes, or as I previously said, I can release all scenes within a specific group or except in group A. Furthermore, we have a release time, and that's just the time it takes to fade out. Okay, so one other thing I want to show you with real-time triggers is the advanced view. And the advanced view essentially can let you pick not only a specific time, but also a specific set of dates. So we can really accurately define the time when our trigger fires. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and pick another real-time trigger. I'm going to click edit. That's going to bring up the basic time mask editor, but we want to go to the bottom left-hand corner here, and where it says show advanced, we're just going to give that a click. Okay, and as you can see, we now have a date and time editor, which allows us to select multiple times or dates. So effectively, any time that's blue is when the trigger is going to fire. So let's say that I wanted a trigger to fire all throughout the month of December at specifically 5 o'clock. I could have all of my years selected because I want it to happen every year. And you're going to need to make sure that all of the days are selected as well. Once you've done that, select the appropriate time that you want it to fire at. So for me, that's going to be 5 o'clock. And then, of course, I can have my minutes and seconds set to on the hour as well. And that's going to make sure that this fires on every single year, but only in December. And of course, it's going to fire at 5 o'clock as well. And this would be for my timeline, let's say, for timeline number 2, which might be something Christmas related. So one of the things that I want to go through now is how you would integrate Pharos with some kind of relay device. Now, bearing in mind, not all of our controllers have inputs, but the LPC does. Obviously, if your controller doesn't have an input, you can always add a remote device, a Rio to it, and that will give you either a set of inputs and outputs depending on the configuration that you go for. But for now, because we're working with an LPC, we're just going to go ahead and just set up a basic relay device. So down here, we have an option for digital input. Select that. And this is going to allow you to select an input. We have 8 on the LPC. I'm going to go ahead and select input number 1. And then you're going to get an event, which is either low or high. And I should be clear that low and high just simply means the resistance within the circuit. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and then, of course, attach whatever action you want to it. Again, I'm just going to stick with scenes and timelines for now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to attach a scene to it, such as scene number 3. So this is quite useful if you want to have a really simple integration with either something like a building management system or a fire alarm, or alternatively, if you just wanted to create something that responds to a normal switch, you can do that as well just by hooking that up to the LPC. I should state there are 2 modes for this. There is the contact closure mode that you can set it to, and there's also the digital mode. And the way that you would configure those is by selecting the unit in the network view, going up to the interfaces tab, and then you have an option to set up the inputs as either contact closure, digital, or analog. Just a quick reminder, contact closure is a dry circuit with no power in it. A digital circuit is obviously a circuit but with power. The inputs are rated a max 24 volts. And then finally you have an analog input, and that's going to work a little bit like a dimmer. So a variable is going to be produced as that power increases, which we can later use in some of our actions. For now though, just keep it as contact closure. Now what I want to come on to is actually getting the touchscreen interface integrated within the system as well. So this is really, really easy to do. But one of the things that you need to remember is the button or slider or color picker keys that we've set up in the previous tutorial. So I just want to quickly go back and just give you a quick reminder. The interface editor, in the right hand side, you'll find the key. So you can see that all of these keys are unique for the buttons. And of course, I will be using these within my triggers to identify them. So just going back to the trigger view now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to the touch button event trigger now. And essentially what that's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to fire a trigger whenever a button has been pressed. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. Up in the top right hand corner here, you will notice that there is a button box. Now this button box is going to essentially allow us to pick a key, which is like an identifier for our TPC buttons. And as you can see, it says press tab for suggestions. And that's going to then bring up all of our button keys. So I'm going to start by selecting button number 1 or button 001. And I'm then going to attach that to an action. Now I've used the start timeline and start scene actions quite a lot already. One of the things that I want to show you is that we have the ability to toggle a timeline. So toggling essentially is where if a timeline is essentially off stage, it's not playing, the button press will then start the timeline. And effectively, once the timeline is then playing, if the button is hit again, it will then release. It will toggle between starting it and stopping it. Just like before, go ahead, select the timeline that you want to. And then if you want to, what you can do now is you can go ahead and you can actually duplicate that trigger over and over again and just edit some of the parameters within it just to make your programming a little bit easier. So you can go right click, duplicate trigger. You can then go up to the top right hand corner and change the button key. And you can, of course, just then go ahead and change the timeline number as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. And once I'm happy with that, I'm going to then create one more trigger. This is button number 6, my all off button, which I created in the previous tutorial. And this is going to just simply release all playback within the system. Okay, so for touch buttons, it's really nice and easy to set them up, but with sliders and color pickers, you need to take an extra step in order to make sure it works correctly. And it's at this point that I'm going to introduce the concept of something called variables. So for instance, we've got a slider, and the slider is going to be used for setting the master intensity. So essentially how bright a lighting scene is or how bright a set of fixtures are. Now the slider can produce a value from 0 to 255. And essentially what we need to do is we need to extract that value from the slider, and then we need to then inject that into an action. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. We're going to just start by closing these. And then I'm going to click new slider move. So that's obviously for the sliders. Just like before, I'm going to hit tab. That's going to bring up my slider keys, select slider 001. And now I'm going to bring up the master intensity action. Okay, so the first thing is that I can either target all my fixtures or specifically a group of fixtures. It's really up to you. For now, though, I think I'm going to have this just master my tower set of fixtures. Now, one thing you will notice down here is that it's going to immediately set these fixtures to 100% every single time this slider is moved. Now, that's not exactly what we want. We want the ability to control the intensity, to bring it up and to bring it down. And this is where we need to enable our variable system. So at the top right hand corner here, you have 3 dots. So go ahead and click that. And underneath this, you'll see now that you have a button that's called Enable Variables, but you have a quick description here first, which I think is always good to read out. So this action supports variables, a powerful feature that allows you to capture data from the trigger to determine the behavior of actions. Would you like to enable variables in this project? I'm going to go ahead and click yes. And now, instead of setting it to a percentage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to a variable of 1. Because that slider will essentially only produce one set of variables. It's either going to be 0 or 255, but it's never going to be anything out of that bounds. And of course, there's only one slider, so you're going to set it to variable number 1. Optionally, you can give it a fade time as well. I'm going to give it a fade time of 0.2, and that's just going to allow it just to look a little bit less steppy and just transition between the different values that it obtains from the slider. So that's setting up a very, very basic action with one variable. But if you take something like a color picker that can produce red values, green values, and blue values, you're going to need to set up more than one variable. So I'm going to go ahead and select a new trigger, and this is going to be for the color picker, and we want to select the touch color change trigger. Up in the right hand corner, you'll see that again, just like before, there is an option to press tab for suggestions, and that in turn will bring up our keys. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the set RGB action. And that set RGB action is going to allow us to change the RGB values of a specific set of fixtures. So go ahead, select that. The first thing we'll need to do, just like before, is set up the target. Do we want to set up this action to target a specific fixture or maybe a group of fixtures? I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to target my stairs. And of course, you'll notice underneath us, we have different parameters which we can enable and disable. So the intensity and of course, RGB values. So intensity by default is set to a hard value of 255. Now we need to remember that 255 is max, okay? So this is automatically going to set it to max intensity. But what you will notice underneath this is red, green, and blue is set to variables 1, 2, and 3. And that's because this touch color change trigger will produce 3 different variables: a red variable, a green variable, and a blue variable, and in that order, which is why you set them to variable 1, which is red, variable 2, which is green, variable 3, which is blue. Just like before, I'm going to go ahead and set up another fade time, so 0.2, maybe 0.3 seconds. It's completely up to you. And again, that's just going to make sure that it doesn't feel so steppy. So sometimes we need to integrate with different systems. Again, we have different options for setting those up. So we have some triggers here to do that, and the most common ones are serial, Ethernet, and DMX. DMX is fairly self-explanatory, but I will quickly look at it. We obviously have a channel, and then we have a value, and we can select whether the trigger should fire when it enters range or whether it changes in range. But for now, I'm just going to give you an example of a Ethernet input trigger and how that would work. So an Ethernet input trigger is specifically used when you want to send a command over a network, okay? The protocols that we support are TCP, UDP, and multicast. You can select those protocols by, first of all, selecting your main controller within your project, so your network primary. And then what you need to then go ahead and do is go to the interfaces tab, go to where it says Ethernet, select one of the 5 buses and select a type of protocol. And as I said before, we support UDP, TCP, and multicast. So for this demonstration, I'm going to pick TCP. And then what I'm going to need to do is open up a port on my controller. So generally speaking, it's recommended that you leave the first 1024 ports reserved within your system, as a lot of other protocols use those. So pick a port number that's a lot higher than that. A common port number to go to would be something like 8080. So essentially what that's going to do is that's going to open up that port on the controller so that it can receive those commands. So once I'm done with that, I can go back to the trigger view. I can select the bus that I've just set up, bus number 1, and then I'm going to need to enter in a string. And a string is essentially a command that we're going to receive. So timeline _1. Now, a quick note, what you should try to do wherever possible is use something called a terminating character. And that's going to do various different things, but essentially it's just going to tell our controller that we've received the command and that it can clear its buffer and it doesn't need to wait for any other commands. So typical scenario of how you would do this is you would use something like \r. You can also use \n as well. So now that we've received that command, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick an action. So I'm going to pick timeline number 1. And then finally, just do an upload to the controller just to check that that works. Okay, so once I've done that and I've uploaded that to the controller, I'm going to go ahead and test that now. So to do that, I'm going to use a third-party bit of software. We don't make this. It's called Packet Sender, but it is free to download for both Mac OS X and Windows. So this is essentially just going to let me send a command over the network to my controller just to test my programming. So I'm going to go ahead and click send. That's now sent the command. And if I go into my controller's log viewer, I've got an inbound TCP connection. We've then received some data. And of course, the trigger has matched and the action has then gone ahead and started. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in the next one.